Okay, this week's Parsha Vayakel. Vayakel Moshe is called Adas b'nei Yisrael. Moshe assembled the complete congregation of Bnei Yisrael, said to them, Eila Dvorim, Ashetziva Hashem Lasos Osam. These are the things that Hashem had commanded to do them, Lasos Osam. So Rashi's, what exactly did he assemble the Jews? L'mochros Yom Kippurim, Sheyurad Minahor. It was the day after Yom Kippur. He came down on Yom Kippur with the second set of tablets, which was an indication the Jews were fully reinstated and forgiven for the Chet of Egel, for the golden calf. And now they're given the order about building the Mishkan. This was right after Yom Kippur. He came down on Yom Kippur. Next day, Vayakel Moshe's Kodlas b'nei Yisrael, and he tells them, Eila Dvorim, these are the things which Hashem had said, which we'll see in a moment, which is the laws of Shabbos. As the Torah continues, 6 days your work shall be done. And the seventh day should be Kodesh, holy. Shabbos Shabbosim Hashem. Shabbos Shabbosim, there's like a reiteration of Shabbos. Shabbos Shabbosim. A full refrain. Kolosem Melochem Yumos, one who does Melocha on Shabbos is subject to the death penalty. Now, the Torah differentiates between Shabbos and Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, there's a negative commandment of Lo Sasko Melocha. You're not permitted to do creative activity. And there's also mitzvah, say, a positive commandment of Tishbos. You must refrain. Except the refrain of Yom Tov is different than the refrain of Shabbos. Yom Tov, the only type of creative activity is not permitted is called Melechas Avoda. Work which is not related to food-related activities. But on Yom Tov, food-related activities are permitted. On Shabbos, it's Shabbos Shabboson. Not only a work-related activity is not permitted, even food-related activities are not permitted. That's why there's a reiteration of Shabboson, you must refrain. The refrain of Shabbos is different than the refrain of Yom Tov. The Mishnah tells us in the Megillah that what is the difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur? Just as Shabbos, all 39 areas of creative activity are off limits, are not permitted. Yom Kippur, it's also not permitted. Yom Kippur also says Shabbos Shabboson. Yom Kippur, there's a double refrain. So the Mishnah says, well, what's the halach difference between the two of them? What the level of liability is. Shabbos, if one violates the Shabbos, the liability is the death penalty. If you violate the Yom Kippur, the liability is koris, spiritual excision. So, but again, there's a reiteration of Shabboson to indicate that not only is Melechas Avoda, creative activity, which is not work-related, which is not food-related, not permitted, even food-related creative activity is not permitted. Yom Kippur is no different than Shabbos. Okay, so that's Shabbos Shabbosim. So here Rashi explains in Sheshes Yomim, Higdim lem asor Shabbos l'tzivi melechas hamishkan. Why does it mention the prohibition of doing creative activity on Shabbos before the Melechas HaMishkan? Lo ma'ashein edochas Shabbos, to teach us that the building of the Mishkan does not supersede the Shabbos, which we had earlier. But that's based on the juxtaposition. That first we talk about the prohibition of Shabbos, then we talk about the Melechas HaMishkan, that it does not supersede it. Over here, the Refrain Kodesh points out something very nice. It says, El Kol Adas B'nei Yisrael. He spoke to all the congregation of Israel. Why all the Jews? So he explains that we had read earlier when Moshe Rabbeinu came down, we read the last week's parsha, he was Koren Naraponov. His face radiated holiness, and people were afraid to look at him. And he only exposed his face when he taught the Jews Torah, and we would not teach him Torah, he wore a mask. Why? Because the only time they were permitted to benefit and look at this radiance of Kedusha, of holiness, was only when the Torah was being communicated to them. Otherwise, they were not permitted to look at it, to look at that radiance, the Korinor Ponov. So therefore, he covered his face with a mask. You know, Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael that when he ascended to Shemayim to study the Torah from Hashem, he says to them, the 40 days that I was in heaven, day and night, I did not eat bread, I did not drink water. And the Mishnah says, why is this an important piece of information for us to know? That when he was in Shemayim, when he was in heaven, he did not eat bread, did not drink water. So the Medrash says, what he was saying to them was, Kishem shemosarti chelbi v'domi aleim. Just as I gave my fat and my blood for the sake of the Torah, meaning I minimized my physicality because I did not eat bread or drink water. I mean, miraculously he lived, but factually he was impacted physically by not eating and drinking. And therefore I was qualified, I was in the state to be the receptacle to receive the Torah. You also, if you want to have the greatest level of potential to acquire Torah, you must minimize your physicality. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came down from Shemayim, he was Korinor Ponov, meaning his physicality was spiritualized to such an extent that the holiness of his neshama was able to be reflected through his physicality, because his physicality was not much different than his neshama. His body took on a semblance of his neshama. That's why he radiated. And that's why we mentioned, if you remember, the name of the Shalom Korush, that when Moshe Rabbeinu officiated for the 7 days before Aaron and his children were installed on the 8th day, he did not have to wear vestments because his body was the vestment for his neshama. And I mentioned, if you remember, the Ramchal writes, there are only two human beings in the history of the world where the neshama was able to be within the body. Adam, before the sin of the Yetzer Das, the body was an appropriate domicile for the neshama because the body was not yet putrefied with evil of Yetzer Das. But once he ate of the Yetzer Das, the neshama ascended above the body and therefore it hovers over the head. Moshe Rabbeinu, even his physicality was so spiritualized that Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama was able to dwell within his body because the body was an appropriate location for the neshama. This is the Korinor Ponov of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara tells us in Shabbos that, and this we read last week, that as a result of Chet Egel, the Jews, when they said Nasa Nishma, each Jew received a level of distinction, 2 crowns. It was a spiritual distinction. One for Nasa, one for Nishma. When they were involved in the Chet Egel, Hashem says they must remove those crowns. They must forfeit those levels of spirituality. The crown for Nasa, the crown for Nishma. Who received those crowns? Were they just taken away, were not given to anyone? So the Gemara says that the reason why Moshe was able to radiate to such a degree is because he received all that, those levels of distinction of Shishim Ribo, of 600,000 Jews. It means 1,200,000 crowns Moshe Rabbeinu received, and that was the ultimate level of his spiritualization. That's why it was Korinor Ponov. This is Moshe Rabbeinu. So therefore, the Or Chaim HaKadosh writes over here, just to give some background, why does he have to say, when you gather all Adas B'nai Yisrael, because when they see the radiance, they'll be fearful to approach him. They feel they're not worthy. Hashem says, no, you must gather all of them, no matter what. They must all be exposed to that radiance when you communicate the Torah to them. That's what's Kol Adas B'nai Yisrael, all the Jewish people, the whole congregation. Lo svaro eish b'chol moshe sechem yom HaShabbos. You're not permitted to kindle fire in all your communities on Shabbos. So there's a machlokes in the Gemara in Shabbos. I mean, just where do we learn all the creative activities that you're not permitted to do on Shabbos? We learned that from the Mishkan. Whatever creative activity was needed to build the Mishkan, that's creative activity that you're not permitted to do on Shabbos. So why does the Torah have to isolate or speak specifically about the activity of kindling fire? Is to tell us that Havara Lav Yotzos, that for every malacha, any one of the creative activities of the 39, the liability is the death penalty, and if one violates it inadvertently, you bring a chatos, a sin offering. However, for kindling, it's less of a malacha, and there's no liability of death penalty. That's the Lav Yotzos. It's discussed specifically, isolated to tell me that there's less a liability, or no. To tell me that although the Torah writes one lav, one negative kemelosaskum malacha, let's say a person does all 39 malachos during one unawareness. Person wakes up Saturday morning, and he believes it's Sunday, and he violates all lamates malachos. How many chatos does he have to bring? If a person eats chaylev, that's the non-kosher fat in a kosher species, he eats the chaylev inadvertently. How many chatos does he have to bring? He eats multiple measures of chaylev. All day he's eating chaylev, he thinks he's eating kosher meat. Or he's not aware that chaylev is not kosher. He brings one chatos. Why? Because he violated the lav of chaylev during one awareness, because it's one lav. So if a person would violate, what about if he eats chaylev and then he's informed he ate chaylev? He ate this non-kosher fat. So the moment he's informed, he has not to bring a chatos. And now, again, mistakenly eats chaylev. Inadvertently, he has to bring another chatos. Why? Because since he was informed before he ate the second chatos that he'd eaten the first one inadvertently, he has an obligation to bring another chatos. But if it's during one, it's called one hell and one unawareness. Although he ate multiple measures of chatos, he brings one chatos. Of chaylev brings one chatos. But if one violates, why? Because it's one negative commandment. The Torah says you're not permitted chaylev. When we speak about you're not permitted to violate the Shabbos, how many negative commandments does the Torah express itself? One, lo saska malocha. So I would say if one does all 39 creative activities during one unawareness, how many chatos would you have to bring? How many sin offerings? One for all 39. That the Torah goes and speaks about havora separately to tell me no, that although they're stated as one negative commandment, but just as havora, we see that as an individual lav. And that's why it's spoken about individually, identically. Every one of the creative activities, we look at it as a separate lav. And therefore, if you violate all 39 creative activities during one unawareness, you must bring 39 chatos. You must bring 39 sin offerings for every one of the negatives, every one of the creative activities, which are different than the other, which you violated inadvertently. So the reason why the Gemara now it speaks about specifically havara, not because there's a lesser liability, but rather to tell us, just as this is seen as separate, although it was included within Losasim Malocha, identically every one of the creative activities, we see them as individual lavim, negative commandments. Therefore, for every one of them, you must bring an individual chatos for every one of the categories of the creative activity. The Torah tells us that Moshe prophesied in the wake state. He's the only Navi that prophesies in the wake state. However, during Kabbalah Torah, all the Jews prophesied in the wake state because they heard the Aser Sadibros. They were in a wake state, and Hashem communicated to them in a wake state. And every other Navi, other than that particular moment, only prophesies in the sleep state. Moshe Rabbeinu always in a wake state. Why? And why did the Jews during the receiving of Torah prophesy in the wake state? Because when a Navi normally prophesizes, God communicates to him. It's not through the physical faculty of any part of the body, the brain. It's directly to the neshama. Because the body itself is not pure enough to have relevance to Hashem's to that connection, to that communication. So it's always the soul. Moshe Rabbeinu, that he spiritualized his body to such a degree, he was able to prophesy even in a wake state. It wasn't considered inappropriate for him to prophesy the wake state because his body was pure enough to prophesy in a wake state. Okay? Now, so why did the Jews prophesy in the wake state at Sinai? Because it was important for them to know, because they saw openly that Hashem communicated with Moshe, and it was important to understand that Moshe is the source of all Torah. That Moshe is God's spokesman, as the Rambam says in Hilchos Sodei Torah. Since every Jew, it's not hearsay, but rather they witnessed themselves how God communicated with Moshe Rabbeinu, as though that anything from that time going forward, Moshe says it's the word of Hashem, because Moshe was chosen openly for every Jew to be God's spokesman. That's why they had to prophesy in the wake state to witness this themselves, that in a wake state, they witnessed Moshe being the recipient of that communication. Okay? But after that happened, so factually they weren't qualified, but it was only for that purpose. Therefore, that was the exception. God allowed them to be able to survive it. Now the question is like this. The first time the Torah speaks about Moshe being a prophet was at the burning bush. He was shepherding the flocks of his father-in-law, Yisro, and he was near the desert, and he sees a bush burning, and he sees something unusual. The bush is burning, and it's not consumed by the fire. He approaches it, and Malach Hashem speaks to him. The angel speaks to him. The question is, that experience there, was he in a wake state, or was he in a sleep state? That's a question. If you learn that he was in the wake state then, that means he was pure enough that the Shekhinah could directly communicate with his physicality. This is before Korin Arponov. That he radiated was even a more advanced level. So if that's the case, his body, if the Shekhinah could communicate directly with him in a wake state, that means that he was pure enough for the Shekhinah to directly be in contact. If that's the case, the Neshama already was within his body even at that time, even at the time of the burning bush. But if you say then he wasn't yet qualified, that means his body wasn't pure enough at that moment. As a result of that, you'd say the Neshama at that time by Moshe Rabbeinu was hovering above his head. It was not in the body because it wasn't sufficiently purified that the Shekhinah, that the Neshama could be within it. It only happened later. So seemingly it would be dependent on this argument of Rishonim. When did he begin prophesying in a wake state, Moshe Rabbeinu? But the radiance, that happened as a result of all the Jews forfeiting their spiritual crowns of spiritual distinction. That was transferred to Moshe Rabbeinu. There's an Orchaim HaKodesh at the end of Devarim that says something phenomenal, that the crowns that we forfeited at Sinai, the Nasa V'Nishma, and Moshe received, and he quotes a Zohar, every Shabbos, every Jew receives for that 24-hour period those crowns that he forfeited. Every single Jew. So we speak about the Neshama Yisera, that Shabbos there's an expanded spiritual dimension to a Jew's soul. Shabbos, because we have that advanced soul, that expanded spiritual soul, which is Me'ein Olam Haba, and therefore we're worthy, we receive a relationship which is a semblance of the world to come. Those two distinctions, levels of distinction, are returned to every Jew. And for the Nasa and Nishma, Motzei Shabbos comes, we forfeit it. And where does it go? It goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So every week, Moshe Rabbeinu returns it to us. It's removed from Moshe, gives back to every Jew, receives it in return. Motzei Shabbos comes, we lose it, and it goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is how he explains, we say, Yismach Moshe Matnas Chelko. Moshe Rabbeinu rejoiced with the Matnas Chelko, with the gift of his chelik. Kevin Nemakrosalo. He's happy to be satisfied with his own portion and release these crowns back to every Jew every Shabbos. That's how the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, based on the Zohar, explains when we say Yismach Moshe Matnos Chelko, Ki Eved Nemakrosalo, because he was the true servant of Hashem. He's satisfied with his own chelik, his own portion, and therefore he releases back to every Jew those 2 crowns of distinction every Shabbos. We've mentioned that there's an argument in the Gemara when the Torah goes and isolates lo survival you're not permitted to kindle fire. Is the purpose of speaking about kindling to tell us that there's less liability, or is to tell us that although the Torah expresses the prohibition of doing creative melacha on Shabbos as one lav, we see them as each creative activity as a separate lav. And as a result of that, there are going to be multiple sin offerings brought to the inadvertency of transgressing every one of those areas of creative activity. So over here, the Sifarno and others say this also. If it's only a lav, meaning it doesn't carry liability of the death penalty, so why is it less of a? We learn all the malachas, all the creative activity from the Mishkan. Now, to be liable for the transgression of Shabbos, it has to be melech smach Shabbos. It has to be within the context of constructive. It's constructive. What about if it's destructive? You do a malacha which is destructive. There's no liability. Because everything's learned from the Mishkan. Just as in the Mishkan, everything was constructive, not destructive. As a result of that, the only time you're in violation of Shabbos that it carries this liability, if it's constructive, not destructive. Okay, for instance, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, normally when you dig a hole, one is in violation of binyan, because when you dig in the ground, they had dug in the Mishkan, and the Gemara speaks about where exactly we find binyan. Well, binyan is definitely anything that takes on a permanent, you build, takes on a permanent status, no question, you're in violation of building. Now, what about if a person goes and he digs a hole in the field, and he digs the hole, and now you can't plow the field appropriately? You're not in violation of digging that hole. What about if you'd have a mound in the field, a mound, and as though that the plow cannot go over that mound, and you go and you remove the mound, so now you're able to plow that field more easily? You're in violation of binyan. You're making a correction in the fixed property. So removing a mound, that's binyan. What about if a person has in his home, you have the floor is not even, and there's a protrusion, there's a little mound, and you remove it, you're in violation of binyan. That's binyan because you're correcting the floor. You're fixing the floor, that's binyan. Let's say you have to dig a hole to create a storage location in the field, that's binyan, because you're doing something which is constructive rather than destructive. Just examples of this. Now, so every malacha has a constructive aspect and a destructive aspect. What about burning, when you burn something? Even though the value of burning a fire is constructive for cooking, for smelting, for whatever it may be, but burning, kindling, is a consumption of fuel. So there's a certain destructive aspect to every time you kindle. So because it has that destructive aspect, although the value is constructive, that's the reason why the Torah minimizes, says the level of liability is less liability for kindling rather than all the other 39 areas of constructive activity. Because the others, there's no destructive component or characteristic to any of those malachos. But since kindling does, as a result of that, one has this lesser liability than the other malachos. This is what the Sifarno explains here, and others say the same thing. What's the actual application? Very interesting discussion. There's a famous Rashi in Be'er. Now, what's the chiddush of transporting? The Torah says you're not permitted to transport from domain to domain, from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, private domain to public domain. And we explained many times, private domain doesn't mean private property. meaning an area according to most Rishonim, which is circumscribed with 3 mechitzos. And I say mechitzos specific, not walls. 3 mechitzos. That means an enclosure which is 10 tefachim in height. 10 tefachim in height. It's enclosed on 3 sides. According to majority Rishonim, that area which is circumscribed with 3 mechitzos is Rishus HaYochid. Okay? So if you transport from that location into a public domain, you transport it from private domain to public domain. Regarding the item that you transport, there's no change in the item. There, you're just changing location, right? Taking from one domain to another domain. Every other malacha, there's an innate change, creative change, a constructive change in what you're doing, whether it's weaving, whether it's dyeing, whether it's cooking, whether it's building, whatever it may be. Here, the item itself is the same item. The same article, you're just taking it from domain A to domain B. Or vice versa, you're in violation and has liability to death penalty. So also, it doesn't share a common characteristic with all the other lamates malachos. They're all creative. Transport is not creative. Kindling, although it's for creative, constructive purposes, cooking, smelting, whatever it is, but in itself, the only way you create that fire is by consuming fuel. You're destroying fuel. So because it has that component to it, therefore, it has less liability. Okay? Now, the Gemara asks in Shabbos, we find all the malachos, all the creative activities found in the Mishkan. The Gemara asks, where do we find transporting? Where do you find transporting even dalar amshus arabim? You're not permitted to transport 4 cubits in public domain. If you have an item lying in one location in public domain, and you remove it from its original location and you transport it 4 amos and bring it to rest in the second location, you're a violation of transporting. Where do we find such a thing? So Gemara says, Halochum Shabi Sinai. It was not in the Mishkan. It was not. It was ordained at Sinai that action of taking something public domain from location A to location B is the equivalent of transporting from domain to domain. Has the same thing. But either way, that malacha, there's nothing constructive within the object that you're transporting from domain to domain. Okay? So we have 2 malachos which have very different characteristics. We rule out malacha that you're in violation of havora as all the others. Carries the death penalty. Havora, kindling, we're only going to explain the opinion that says it's a lesser liability. Now, what's the halacha Yom Tif? We explained that Yom Tif, food-related activities are permitted. Because it just says Shabboson. Shabbos and Yom Kippur is a Shabbos Shabboson. There's a double refrain. Not only for creative activity, which is not food-related, even food-related activities are not permitted on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. Yom Tif, it's only Shabboson, one level of refrain, if it's not food-related. What about a food-related activity? You bake or cook on Yom Tif for the weekday. Right before sundown, as Yom Tif is going to be over, you put something in the oven. And it only at the time of Shkia, it reaches a point that it's baked. So over there, it's not Ochel Nefesh, right? There's no way you could benefit from that creative activity, Yom Tif, because the time it's baked or cooked, it's after Yom Tif. So according to all the Rishonim, other than Rashi, say you get Malchus for that. Because the Torah only permitted Ochel Nefesh when? Only if it's for Ochel Nefesh that you're able to benefit from it on Yom Tif. But since that cooking or baking, you cannot benefit on Yom Tif, therefore you're in violation of what? Of cooking and baking. Because that's not applicable to food related because people can benefit from it. Rashi says no. Rashi says same thing, Garis, but Rashi says if the person goes and kindles or transports, before we talk transports from domain to domain on Yom Tif, it has no benefit. Nobody can benefit from that transporting, let's say rocks, stones. Person transports stones from public domain, private domain. Are you in violation of transporting on the Torah level? Are you permitted? Rashi says no. So they explain, why does Rashi say no? Why does he say no? First of all, it's all based on mitoch. This machlokes in the Mishnah in Be'ah, Beishamai Bisela, where we say food-related activities permitted, doesn't mean it has to be directly food-related, or anything that accommodates the needs of a person, it's permitted. Beisila says food-related activity doesn't mean something that for eating or drinking, but even something that accommodates you. For instance, you want to take a lulav on Sukkot from private domain to public domain. On Yom Tov, not a problem. You want to carry a child from public and private domain, not a problem. You want to take a Sefer Torah, carry Sefer Torah, not a problem. Because if you need it, anything you need, which accommodates your need, you're permitted. Does not be directly transporting food. Why? Because we say, as Torah permits this melacha, when it's directly food-related, anything which has a semblance of food-related accommodates your need, the Torah permits this. And we rule like Beis Hillel, and therefore you're permitted. So now the question is, the melacha of transporting, where you have no benefit from it. There's no benefit at any level. Tosaf's position is, you're in violation of transporting on Yom Tov. Rashi says no. Why? So they base it on Rabbeinu Tam Daf Beis Ben Aleph and Shabbos, because transporting is referred to as melacha gerua. There's a certain deficiency in the melacha. Exactly as we're saying. This is Rabbeinu Tam. Why is transporting melacha gerua? Because in its innateness, there's no change in the item. The item you're transporting is the same object. The only difference is the location. Is it in domain A or is it domain B? Therefore, it's melacha gerua. Therefore, it has a certain less level of severity on Yom Tov. That's Rashi's. Therefore, Rashi says, for all other melachos, it has to have some kind of benefit component. It has no benefit component, you're in violation of Yom Tov, unless it's ochel nefesh related. But if it's not benefit related, no. Transporting, since in its innateness, there's a certain component which is lacking because there's no change in the object whatsoever. Therefore, even if it's for no purpose, one is not in violation of Yom Tov. That's Rashi's position. That's similar to when we speak about kindling. Kindling has a certain component which doesn't fit, is not similar to all the other melachos. It has a destructive component because you have to destroy fuel to create fire, although the fire is for beneficial reasons, value for cooking, baking, or smelting, or something of similar nature.
So what would Rashi say is the violation?
When we erase a letter on Shabbos, or we tear back and destroy those letters, that is like a consumption of the letter.
Good question. There's a malacha called soser, dismantling. You have a building, you demolish a building. The building is destroyed. Are you in violation for demolishing a building? Demolition. You can't be more destructive than that. So the Gemara says in Shabbos, it's only sosam nas livnos. It's only if you demolish for the sake of building. So what's the malacha of soser? Malacha is preparing the site for building something else. Understand? So destructive in the destruction, that's the positive aspect of destroying. The act of destroying is to prepare the location for building. Give you another example. Mochek, a person erases a letter, the location, and you erase it, and the location now is clean, and you can write another letter in the location that you erased. Because you made the erasure, now that location where the letter originally was written, you can write another letter. So the melacha of erasing is only for the sake of preparing the location for a new letter to be written. That's why the erasing is considered constructive, not destructive. Understand? But if a person would just, like you said, tear a letter, it's not an issa d'oraisa. It's an issa d'rabbanan. Mekalkel, rabbinically, mekalkel is not permitted to even do a destructive act. Here we're talking about to be in violation at a Torah level. Okay, so tearing a letter where there's no constructive aspect to it, it's all destructive, you're not in violation. But if you erase a letter, let's say on a parchment, you have a letter, you find a mistake is in the Torah, you have to erase a letter because it has to be corrected. That erasure in the Torah, that's actually a positive action. Because by erasing the letter which doesn't belong to it, it's not written correctly, it's in preparation to write a new letter. So the mochek is a creative, positive act, not a destructive act. Yeah, I understand.
If you were to
burning fuel being burnt, the fuel's being burnt. It's a preparation, it's for the sake of doing something else, cooking, baking, smelting, whatever it may be.
And okay,